Okay, well, we might get started. I'm here to introduce Kenna MacTavish, who's one of my colleagues at the University of Melbourne in the Publishing and Communications program. Kenna is a PhD candidate, and her thesis explores the post-digital affordances of books, platforms, and genre systems. She's already the author of a chapter on tastemaking and bookstagram in the post-digital book cultures collection that's just come out from Monash University Press. So today she's going to be talking about shelving strategies. She's just told me that long title indicates. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Kenna. Thank you, Kenna.
Awesome, thanks, Sybil. I first want to acknowledge that I am currently working and learning on the unceded lands of the Kulin Nation, and that this research was predominantly undertaken in Nipaluna on the lands of the Muanina and Palawa peoples. And I pay my respects to the elders past and present, and I want to extend that respect to any First Peoples who may be here today. David Attenborough's Tasmania premiered on ABC in June 2018. In the opening narration, Attenborough describes Tasmania as a place very different to the mainland of Australia. Separated from the mainland by one of the roughest straits of water in the southern hemisphere, Tasmania's isolation is celebrated by locals and tourists alike. Its distinctive history, natural landscape, and rich culture creates a sense of Tasmanian islandness that Attenborough alludes to in this documentary. As a Tasmanian and a researcher of contemporary book and media culture, this research was guided by the question, how do bookstores in Hobart represent and reproduce Tasmanian islandness? This paper introduces the notion of islandness and positions it at the core of a Tasmanian sense of place. It then examines how Tasmanian regionalism is reproduced through governmental marketing strategies and how this trickles down into the sites of art and media in Hobart. The final section of this paper explores how Tasmanian islandness is reflected in the layouts, bookshelving strategies, and online presence of two Hobart bookstores, Fuller's Bookshop and Crackton Spineless new and used books. Islands are distinct places. The relationships between islands and the mainland are often formed through interactive cultural and political practices. In The Coming of Age of Island Studies, Godfred Baldacchino discusses how locality and externality function in relation to one another. Locality is something that can be manufactured through the cultural and historical landscape of an island. In other words, the locality of an island is insular. It refers to the people and spaces held within the natural barriers. Baldacchino refers to the island as a miniature universe, a bauble of community, society, ecology, and economy. However, islands are also dependent on externality, which is how the locality of an island relates to its mainland surroundings, whether it is dependent on or in opposition to the mainland. Tasmania is an island that has long been depicted as a place distinct from mainland Australia. In her work on Tasmania as a setting in literature, Danielle Wood discusses the way Tasmanian set literature has informed Tasmania's climate and sense of islandness. This sense of islandness directly correlates to Baldacchino's understanding of locality. It is something constructed by the people living within the cultural and historical landscape. Islandness is also inextricably linked to the human component. In the words of J.D. Hash, islanders are not necessarily people who are geographically surrounded by the sea, but are people who say they are geographically surrounded by the sea. Islandness can therefore be understood as a state of being. Tasmania's islandness is made up of an ever-changing number of components, but the overwhelming focus is on Tasmanians' relationship to the historical, cultural, and natural landscape. This relationship is established through government marketing, political campaigns, regional labelling of handcrafts and food and drink products, and the tourism industry. So Tasmania is both an island and a brand. In 2018, when the first iteration of this research took place, Brand Tasmania stated that the Tasmanian essence is far from ordinary, while Tasmania's attributes revolve around natural beauty, creative people, and a rich cultural and natural heritage. At the same time, Tourism Tasmania stated that their role in the broader island culture was to, quote, create demand for travel to the state by connecting people culturally and emotionally to Tasmania. The branding of Tasmania is a clear attempt to reinvigorate the island's locality and externality. By promoting Tasmania as a place loved by locals and celebrated by visitors, Brand Tasmania and Discover Tasmania are working to construct a sense of islandness that appeals to as many people as possible. In 2021, Brand Tasmania released a new campaign centred on the power of place branding. They state, "It's different in Tasmania. We didn't always see this as a strength, but in today's globalised world, as places feel more and more alike, we can use our difference to attract talent, investment, trade and visitors to our state. Let's bring more value to everything Tasmanian." Just as Danielle Wood suggests, islandness has been harnessed for the promotional purposes of in Tasmania. It is this islandness of Tasmania, the distinct charm of the spatially finite, which is at the centre of Tasmania's sense of place. The Tasmanian government actively reproduces regionalism in its branding initiatives. And regionalism is constructed through the culture of a place and can manifest itself in art and sites of media and literature. Literary regionalism can be reproduced through culturally driven literary programs and events. Through their research into one book programs in the United States, Wendy Griswold and Hannah Wall argue that cultural intermediaries working at the front line of reading understand that books with a regional interest, such as a local author or setting, garner more active participation in regional one-book programs. This means that localness is something consciously considered as valuable by reading professionals. Beth Driscoll also recognises the intrinsic value of localness through her case study of the only book town in Australia, the Clunes book town here in Victoria. A book town is a cultural phenomenon that brings lovers of print, often second-hand books, together in a localised setting. Driscoll also notes that this form of cultural tourism causes an increase in the regional literary activity in and around Clunes itself. These two investigations into the rise of literary regionalism demonstrate how a localised book culture can influence the broader reading public. Tasmania is somewhere where regional literary activity has always been strong. As Wood notes, Tasmanian writing being perceived as quite different from Australian writing is not a contested idea. From Island magazine to Tas Writers and the Hobart Writers Festival to the accidentally founded Transportation Press, the distinctness of the Tasmanian literary activity is derived from the islandness that many locals and visitors associate with the dark, dense and isolated island state. Regionalism, and its Tasmanian manifestation as islandness, trickles through the arts and literary sector in Hobart, and its bookstores are no different. As I've stated, Tasmanian islandness is continuously harnessed for promotional purposes across all industry sectors, with value and image as mainstays in the copy of marketing campaigns. Islandness is also harnessed by Hobart's local bookstores. As Anne Steiner writes, the bookshop is a space that is not a neutral area, but is linked to the image and value of the books it contains. The bookstore can also be understood as a lived space, a concept taken from Henry Lefebvre's theory of spatiology, and refers to a combination of the physical and tangible nature of a space and the mental image or concept of a space. Tasmania sections in Hobart bookstores operate as lived spaces. They combine the physical space of being located in Tasmania with the mental image and concept of Tasmania developed out of governmental, cultural and historical branding initiatives. The way these lived spaces manifest are different within each bookstore and their respective shelving strategies. However, Tasmanian islandness is reproduced across every site. Fuller's Bookshop is situated on the corner of Victoria Street and Collins Street in Hobart. On their website, they describe themselves as masterful recommenders, curious readers, eccentrically knowledgeable, community proud, and 90-odd years young. Fuller's Bookshop features a cafe at its rear, and it also runs a small publishing house, predominantly publishing Tasmanian authors. Tasmanian islandness is reproduced in its large Tasmania section at the front left-hand side of the store as you walk inside. As Laura J. Miller writes, at the most basic level, the naming and placement of different sections in a shop is a key element in channeling customers' attention. The front of the store is the most visible section in a bookshop's layout, and therefore is where the most highly trafficked books or sections get shelved. The Tasmania section features new and backlisted releases from Tasmanian authors, coffee table books about Tasmania, walking guides, non-fiction titles, First Nations writing, history, and more. Fuller's uses large hardbacks with instantly recognisable imagery positioned on large circular tables to entice readers into exploring their broader curated shelves, featuring essential reading about the island this bookstore calls home. Tassie Essentials includes In Tasmania by Nicholas Shakespeare, Deep South by Ralph Crane and Danielle Wood, Van Diemen's Land by James Boyce, The Sky Mountain by Donald Nola, among others. The subsections of the Tasmania section are like islands off islands, offering a more detailed or intimate trip through the island depending on what they wish to engage with, whether it be every Richard Flanagan title or a local mushrooming guide in its third print run. Tasmanian Islandness is offered to customers of Fuller's as a lived space manufactured by bookshelving strategies. By isolating the Tasmania section in the most trafficked position in the store, thereby celebrating it, Fuller's reinforce and reproduce regionalism through their store layout and shelving strategies. Much like its hidden Tasmania section, Cracked and Spineless new and used books is tucked away inside a small arcade of cafes off the pavement of Collins Street in Hobart. The first thing you see when you make your way up the stairs into the mismatch of old and new books is a $1 bin of B-format paperbacks. The top of the stairs open into an aisle of book piles, fantasy and humour. The shop is long and high with books piled to the ceilings. As you make your way through the alcoves of horror, graphic novels and crime fiction, you realise fiction does not hold the highly coveted position in this store. Before you reach the long aisles of predominantly second-hand fiction, there is an uncategorised alcove of books spanning shelves and cupboards. At a closer glance, you realise this section is filled with books about Tasmania, books by Tasmanians, and books documenting the history of Tasmania. The physical bookshelving of this hidden Tasmania section is mismatched, while also demonstrating the vast collection of Tasmanian content Cracked and Spineless has on display. From titles such as The History of Scouting in Tasmania to Hobart's Tram trilogy, Islandness is reflected in the niche collection of Tasmanian cultural and historical non-fiction titles, many of which are now out of print. Tasmanian locality and externality thus play out within the walls of the bookstore. A worn copy of The Hermit in Van Diemen's Land by Henry Savoury sits on the shelf. Its position embodies how Tasmanian Islandness is represented in Cracked and Spineless, lone, standing and stuck somewhere in a time forgotten. Cracked and Spineless frame the lived space of lost or forgotten Tasmanian Islandness through their sections of second-hand books and pamphlets, forming an archival space in the middle of a genre fiction-centred store. This brings me to the archival and preservatory role of Hobart's local bookstores. Archival practices have many similarities and crossovers with bookshelving strategies. While bookstores are overwhelmingly commercial sites of publishing, I want to highlight how Tasmanian and regional bookstores more broadly actively work to organise, preserve and celebrate values and an image that goes beyond the commerciality of a lived space. Elizabeth Yale writes that archives and archival practices have stood at the heart of empires, nations, institutions that have defined the modern world. And this understanding of the role of the archive is what I want to flesh out in relation to Tasmanian regionalism and Hobart's bookstores. Archives can be understood as sites where individual lives intersect with the apparatus of the state. This makes archives key sites for understanding conflict between governments and those they rule. The navigational menu on the Fuller's website is a key site for understanding conflict between the Tasmanian government, both historic and now, and those they rule. There is a Tasmaniana section on the site that boasts 1,305 titles. The navigation menu lists the collections in alphabetical order, with Tasmanian Reading Guide and Tasmaniana positioned below collections found in other bookstores such as staff recommendations, bargains and bestsellers. The tagging practices and collection formation practices reproduce their very visible Tasmania section from their brick and mortar store, while also highlighting their Tasmania sections as one of the only distinct collections they can offer customers. Tasmaniana is also the name of an 1879 colonial pamphlet titled Tasmaniana, a description of the island of Tasmania and its resources. The term then is connected to Tasmania's colonial history. Underneath Tasmaniana is the tag First Nations. Fuller's alphabetized their sections, so it is by automation that the First Nations appears first. However, the practice of tagging books with First Nations and Literita Tasmania within a Tasmaniana section speaks to how bookshelving strategies have the capacity to represent conflict between a government and its people in much the same way as historical tagging practices in museum collections, for example. The brand of Tasmania has a troubled identity, and Fuller's reproduces that troubled identity both consciously and unconsciously through both human and automated tagging practices. I lastly want to turn to a space that secondhand bookstores consider quite vital. Cracked and Spineless also spans into a storeroom. The storeroom sits behind the counter, and it is not a browsing space for customers. It's a leftover from when the store was owned by someone else and when the store was called Imperial Bookshop. As Yale writes, archives are sources of history, but they are also its subjects, sites with histories and politics of their own. Much like the hidden Tasmania section in the storeroom offers an archival space for Tasmanian-focused titles that have been lost or otherwise forgotten. However, Richard Sprent, the owner of Cracked and Spineless, runs a lively Facebook page for the shop where he posts new stock, specials, rare finds, humour, and more. The Facebook page is where these well-preserved titles are represented. Richard often refers to his adventures in the storeroom archive as scavenging or scounging, as referenced on the slide, further suggesting that the Tassie books he finds in there were lost and forgotten. The storeroom is shared and documented on social media, reproducing a lived space of Tasmanian Islandness for Facebook users beyond the walls of the shop. This is a practice that is distinct to Cracked and Spineless in their continuation of Imperial Bookshop's role as preservers of Tasmanian literary culture and history. Tasmanian Islandness, then, is a concept that is understood and embraced by government, branding, Tasmanian authors, Tasmanians who live near and afar, booksellers and readers. Islandness is at the core of a Tasmanian sense of place, and this means that it is at the centre of how the island operates on a political, environmental and cultural level. The Tasmania sections in Hobart local bookstores reproduce regionalism in a city characterised by a rich and often troubled cultural and natural history. Even the Hobart franchise of national book retailer Diemen boasts a large, officially brand merchandised Tasmania section on their walls. While Fuller's prides itself on its Tasmanian heritage and ability to construct intrinsically valuable, essential Tasmanian reading, Cracked and Spineless offers its customers historically engaging titles with a focus on hidden gems, difference, and preservation. Tasmanian Islandness is therefore reflected in the bookshelving strategies of Hobart bookstores in a multitude of ways, constructing cultural meanings for an island intoxicated by its isolation. Thank you.
Thanks, Kenna. That was great. We've got some time for questions, so if anyone would like to ask one.
I have a question.
Go for it, Claire.
Thank you, Kenna. That was such an excellent paper. I have a question about something that is not part of your study, so I'm really sorry about that. But as like a book person and former Tasmanian, I was wondering if you could speak to like how people might interact with these spaces, because you talked a lot about like the physical space of the category and thinking about like bookstores as like cultural spaces for like book clubs and book launches and stuff, and even like how customers and authors engage with these spaces, and even like locals versus tourists at all.
That's a really good question. So something I think I can talk a little bit more to Fuller's as an example for this, because it considers itself quite a hub, and I might also note that there are many bookstores in Hobart that do similar things. I just picked these two out as a really good example. But something Fuller's do, which I think is quite interesting, is that when they host author events, and not even just author events, but artist events as well, they especially with larger print like coffee table books with artist books and stuff, they'll have the artists come in and run events there. They always position local authors in front of the Tasmania section in their store. So even though they have a range of areas in the shop itself to host events, they make sure that all of their local events are hosted around that front section, which I think is kind of interesting. And so it provides a backdrop to further kind of support and reinforce the event that's taking place there. Something I find quite interesting about Hobart bookstores more broadly is that locals interact with these Tasmania sections just as much as tourists do. So it's not, it speaks to how the kind of the JD Hash quote of how you're an islander if you just say you're an islander, or you say you're Tasmanian, it means you're Tasmanian. That kind of local obsession with being Tasmanian is very much reinforced by these sections as well. And so often they are spaces where locals will try and go to the more niche sections to get those mushrooming guides, to get those small press published walking guides for the mountain, and other kind of small things that a tourist may not know about. And so there's kind of these extra levels of engagement there. But yeah, I think people engage with them far more than, say, I don't know, other regional focus sections in stores, I guess. Tasmanian's special in that way, I guess.
Yeah, so I was thinking about a similar question in a way, or to what you've been speaking about myself. And as a Queenslander, I would never go to the Queensland section of the bookstore, but nothing against Queensland, but, you know, perfect one day, rubbish the next. But anyway, I would go to UQP's thing of books, and it makes me wonder, you know, when I was your age, you know, UQP was a really big thing in Queensland. It kept me going in many ways as a reader, and I wonder if are there publishers in Hobart at all who complicate perhaps your story of shelving strategies?
I think there are a small number of publishers, like I mentioned Transportation Press, but they're very small. They've only got a couple of titles and have kind of been dormant for a couple of years, I think. And even within Fuller's, they run their own publishing series, and a lot of it is publishing backlisted titles from David Owen, the crime writer, like his Pufferfish series are published by Fuller's, and so you see a lot of that coming out in these sections. But also you're not likely to find David Owen's books in other bookstores in Hobart either. Like Fuller's kind of almost stock them altogether. But I think something that has been and it's not necessarily isolated to Tasmania either. I think we see it in a lot of bookstores now, and I think it was even talked about in an earlier session today. But journal publications are very much a mainstay in those stores now. So Island magazine, whilst it may be a little bit trickier to find on the mainland, and you might only get a current issue, you'll get backlisted issues in those stores down in Hobart, and they'll try and keep as many as possible for as long as possible for people to buy. You've also got Poet, which is a tea store, which is the hub for New Philosopher and Womankind down in Tasmania now. And so that when they came on the scene, everyone thought it might shake things up a little bit, but hasn't really. But I think as hopefully more publishing and the art scene in Hobart continues to grow, I would probably predict that it would be complicated in some way as a result of that.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, does anyone else have a question? Thanks, Chloe.
Hi, Kenna. Thank you for your paper. It was excellent. I don't know if I have a question as much as a sort of comment, sort of like thing. I don't know. But I was thinking a lot about like how bookshops obviously are like a very formative space, as you were saying, they're a live space. And I think they do so much like within a community to, like you say, like create an identity for the consumer. And I was thinking about how that sort of translates when you are a Tasmanian and then you come out of Tasmania and you see Tasmanian books in other bookshops. Like in Melbourne, if I'm in a bookshop and I see a Tasmanian book, I'm like, oh my God, like, yes, like it's that little semblance or like reminder of being back in Tassie and being back in those shops. If you would like to respond to that sort of idea, please do.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think I've been working on, or I've had this research in my head for a really long time, and it's something I like to think about a lot. But I've been thinking as I've moved away from that space as well, I think about that kind of externality thing and thinking about in opposition to, or when people are working with Tasmania. And I still get very excited, like you said, like when you see a Tasmanian title, even like seeing Robbie Arnott's books in bookstores here, like the now winning awards, and people are celebrating him. But I'm still like, oh, it's so nice. It's so nice to see that up here. And so I think when I see Tasmanian books elsewhere, I think part of me is like, oh, maybe I'm just responding to that in a nice way. But then I listen to other people who have kind of moved here or have a fascination with Tasmania, or have, I don't know, went on that honeymoon to Tasmania and now are obsessed with it. It's like it's a space that kind of goes beyond a love of, say, the ACT or WA. Like it's not. People don't think about it in the same way, and I think that's still when you see a Tasmanian book somewhere, you don't think about it in the same way as you would. The identity is too strong, I think.
That's really interesting. Robert's just commented, I don't know if you've seen his comment, that he feels the same about Adelaide. Robert, did you want to expand on that at all?
Yeah, sure, happy to. I'll just admit what I look like, that's all. So the other thought I have is that there is a nearly good enough publisher in Adelaide, Wakefield Press, which does a lot of the South Australian stuff, but doesn't have a very strong presence in any particular bookstore. And it goes through stages of being not quite good enough and then being good enough to keep the ball rolling. And that seems to take up an awful lot of the South Australian space, because South Australia's probably next cab off the rank in terms of population. It is in terms of Tasmania. We're the other state with more senators than members of the House of Reps. But I've been here 30 years and I don't get, and the place that feels insular and parochial to me is still Melbourne, where I came from originally. Apparently, according to my relations, Ballarat is about halfway between Adelaide and Melbourne. Which is an interesting comment spatially.
Yeah, it doesn't feel like it, does it?
Well, it isn't.
No.
It's interesting, Robert. It just made me think, because you're just talking about the publisher not necessarily having representation in one particular store. It just made me think of, I don't know, I think it's almost come to me from gossip. So, but in Tasmania, depending on local authors will have a certain bookstore where they will do their launches and they won't do a launch in other stores.
Yeah.
And it became quite a contested thing a few years ago when Richard Flanagan would always run his author events for a new book in the Hobart bookstore in Salamanca, and then had a falling out with the owner because he agreed to do his book launch at the State Bookshop in North Hobart, and they don't talk anymore. And so the kind of, there's this really weird little kind of political thing happening with like Tasmanian authors, Tasmanian Place, Tasmanian bookstores, that I also don't think you really see. You see it in other places, especially in Melbourne, but the sense of place is not quite as attached to it, I don't think. And so
I wonder about West Australia. That's it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I often wonder why they've had so much better literature than South Australia over the last few decades, and it might, anyway, it's the provincial cultures are actually more different than they seem.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it's fascinating, the thought that in Tassie, it's the authors who complicate the shelving strategies, not the publishing houses.
Yeah.
Right. I wouldn't want to have to deal with Richard Flanagan if I've done the wrong thing by him in terms of organising a launch or something.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we could go on and on talking about this fascinating topic. We might leave it there as it's now after 3 o'clock. But thanks very much, Kenna. That was a very enjoyable and useful discussion, I think. Thanks.